Obviously, it could drag us into what some might call World War III, where it triggered mutual defense pacts. And whereas we're not in World War III, we're definitely in a world of wars. Now, whether those things merge into one larger conflict, that's the big concern, and also the concern is when you look at the players, the networking, the linkages, a Chinese-led axis of Russia, Iran, North Korea. I think we're going to have to start thinking in those sorts of geostrategic terms, and I think we're going to have to view the world and look at these conflicts in those sorts of terms. And that's the center of gravity. As certainly, if you look at the big threat, the one that impacts markets, where the U.S. probably has the biggest financial interest overall.
On the Spot with Michelle Makori is brought to you by Swan Bitcoin.
Hello, I'm Michelle Makori. Thank you for joining us. The international trading system is on the brink of fragmentation due to rising geopolitical tensions. That's according to the United Nations, which says new global trade barriers have nearly tripled since 2019, due mostly to geopolitical rivalry. And there are a multitude of conflicts around the world right now. Tensions are escalating in the Middle East between Iranian-backed Hezbollah and Israel, with Iran saying that an obliterating war would ensue if Israel launches a full-scale attack in Lebanon, which Israel has threatened to do in retaliation to constant missile and rocket bombardments from Hezbollah into Israel's north. The US and Europe are warning Hezbollah to stop its missiles and rocket strikes on northern Israel and back off from a wider Mideast war, as the war between Hamas and Israel still continues. And the Russia-Ukraine war is showing no signs of diplomatic resolution. On the contrary, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has recently announced that Washington will soon deliver an additional $2.3 billion in security assistance for Ukraine, including anti-tank weapons, interceptors, and munitions for Patriot and other air defense systems. And in the meantime, Russia is warning that it may take unspecified measures in response to U.S. drone flights over the Black Sea. Now, those are just the biggest wars currently raging. There are several conflict flashpoints around the globe that can escalate at any time. But my next guest says that there is a significant geopolitical threat that is not receiving much mainstream attention and could in fact spark a world war, or at the very least spiral into a situation with crippling economic impact. Hal Kempfer is the CEO of GRIP, Global Risk Intelligence and Planning, an international consulting and training firm focused on strategic risk intelligence and planning. Hal is a retired Marine intelligence officer with over 24 years of service. Hal, welcome back. Good to have you back with us on Kitco.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right, Hal, I want to get your thoughts on several of these flashpoints I mentioned. But before we do, let's start with what you have said is a situation that is at an extreme risk of escalation, and that's the South China Sea. And there have been recent clashes there between Chinese and Philippine forces. And you say that there's a risk that it could drag the U.S. into a war with China because this could trigger the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty and then spark a major global conflict with various countries. So, Hal, help us understand why you're focused on the South China Sea. What's the latest there? And why, in your mind, this is one of the top threats?
Michelle, certainly I don't ignore the what's going on in Europe with the war in Ukraine, and certainly what's happening in the Middle East and with Iran. But if you really want to look at where there is a huge potential impact, not just in terms of war fighting, in terms of the kinetics, the potential carnage, if you will, that takes place in war, but also the impact on markets, you really have to look at the South China Sea. As you mentioned, the Philippines, it has become an ongoing series of confrontations at sea. The Philippines has an old basic landing ship that the U.S. had built in World War II that they grounded at the Second Thomas Shoal. It's within their exclusive economic zone under UN treaty. They've been manning that to maintain a position there. China has this overarching claim that they basically claim pretty much the entire South China Sea as Chinese waters. And what's happened is simple resupply missions have become major events where they're ramming boats. They're using the Chinese Coast Guard is using water cannons. This thing is on a hair trigger, and if it goes kinetic, that's where that mutual defense treaty steps in. That's where the U.S. could be pulled in if it goes that way, and it's ongoing. It's not dissipating.
But it seems to have escalated earlier in June, where apparently Filipino soldiers said that they had to use their bare hands to fend off armed Chinese Coast Guard personnel. Explain what happened and why that particular altercation is raising concern.
Michelle, it wasn't just bare hands, although that was part of it. Actually, if you look at video that was on it, you would see that the Chinese had taken out knives and axes. They were actually attacking the boats that the Philippines were on. In one case, they rammed their boat into a Philippine boat, and it's not clear, but it looks like it almost severed the thumb of one of the Philippine sailors. That's what's happening there. There was one point where they were blocking a Philippine resupply mission, and it's not quite clear. First, it was reported that the Philippine sailors actually had possibly their weapons drawn. Then that was kind of walked back a little bit, say no, they just had their hands on the weapons. But either way, it got very close to turning into a firefight or a gunfight at sea. That's what was happening with that situation. The Chinese have made it very clear that they see this as Philippine, or they see it as Chinese waters. They see any Philippine resupply mission or any Philippine forces out there, or even Philippine fishing boats, as basically an incursion onto their sovereign waters. And what they did some years back was they took a lot of Chinese naval ships and they painted them white, and they took off a couple of deck guns. They said Chinese Coast Guard, and it was to make it look like it was sort of a little kinder, friendlier presence, if you will, at sea. But they have flooded the South China Sea with Chinese Coast Guard. And what they do is they're basically an enforcement mechanism for this overarching claim, which I should mention, the international court has heard the Chinese claim. They threw it back at them, said there is no basis in international law. There is no basis under the UN Conventional Law of the Sea. And so the Chinese lost in court. Now they're trying to compensate by physical presence on the water.
Okay, but Hal, the South China Sea has long been very contentious. Not only China and the Philippines claim it, or parts of it, also Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan. As you just mentioned, China claims almost the entire South China Sea, and not just by name. And as you just said, that was invalidated by an international tribunal back in 2016. But my point is that this is an ongoing issue. This is nothing new. Why are you concerned about this now? Why are these clashes potentially worse than previous ones?
It's the level of activity that's really changed. It's the operational tempo, or op tempo, as you like to say. If you look down and around the Philippines, they're constantly confronting Philippine vessels. They're becoming more and more, audacious in terms of what they're willing to do. You know, there's a thing that in maritime matters called scraping paint. That's when ships will touch. They don't actually ram each other. They're getting very close to doing ramming operations. Of course, they've been for quite some time. They've been using these water cannons to attack Chinese fishing boats. But then you go further north and you start to see what they're doing around the Philippines. And what they have done, or not Philippines, I'm sorry, around Taiwan. And what they have done is they have increased the operational tempo with air incursions and seaborne, basically practicing for either a very large naval blockade or a possible amphibious assault on Taiwan to forcibly take Taiwan, to repatriate it, as they would say, to China. These things aren't happening in isolation. They're happening all at the same time. And frankly, that the U.S. and others are tied up with this big war in Europe and this big war in the Middle East. Some may say that's coincidental. If you look at where Chinese position with Iran and Russia, they are the number one backer of Russia across the board. They have been doing Belt and Road Initiative activities with Iran for some time. They basically have turned Russia into almost a vassal state, if you will, economically speaking, keeping Putin and Russia afloat economically during this war. And with that said, that is drawing a lot of resources that the U.S. might have for other things. If you look at the Houthi rebels and what they're doing in the Red Sea, that ties up naval assets that might be patrolling in the South China Sea. In fact, we're putting in a carrier task force that was just in South Korea that is now having to basically cross over to go to the Red Sea area to defend against Houthi rebel Houthi rebel missiles and drones, I should say. And that gives you an idea of just how disruptive these other wars are and how it makes the South China Sea less protected than it otherwise might be.
Right. So you think that this is then an intentional provocation from China? They're intentionally provoking the Philippines here.
I they're definitely intentionally provoking the Philippines. I mean, that's their operations. But I think if you look at Chinese national interest, these other wars are very much in their national interest to keep going. Now, whether they actually had a role in starting these things or instigating these things, I want to give some credit to Chinese intelligence. I don't think they were ignorant of what was going on prior to this. They're simply too well ingrained within that, what's often called an axis, if you will, or as my old boss, former Secretary of Defense, retired Marine General Jim Mattis calls it a Chinese-led axis that includes Russia, Iran, and North Korea. If you look at it that way, then you'd say from an intelligence standpoint that China is very cognizant of not just what's happening, but cognizant of things that are going to happen. And if you look at their role working with Iran, certainly their huge role working with North Korea, and then you look at what North Korea was doing in providing missiles to Iran. If you look at what Russia's doing now with North Korea, and you look at what China's doing with Russia and all of these things, it really is an intertwined relationship on many different levels. The thing for us, though, we have to look at is the South China Sea. It's a huge amount. I mean, most of the maritime commerce of the world travels through the South China Sea. 44% of maritime container traffic travels through that small Taiwan Straits, to give you an idea. So it's an absolute critical artery, if you will, for global trade. And if the South China Sea is blocked, then you have this very circuitous thing where they have to go around. Shipping would have to go around Australia, adding phenomenal amounts of ton miles. And by the way, I should mention with the Red Sea and the Houthi rebels, that has had a disruptive effect. I mean, that's about 15% of maritime shipping goes through there. But with that has added 5% to global, what they call ton miles, which is, basically cargo and the number of miles it has to do. 5% is a very significant impact to the global market.
Hal, definitely want to unpack in greater detail all of this economic consequence and the economic impact of these shipping trade routes being impacted. But before we do that, you mentioned a few minutes ago that you think that this could potentially be instigated by the Chinese to some degree, that these other conflicts worldwide, surely the Chinese know about them, but you implied that they may also be more active in them than that would initially appear. Can you elaborate on that?
Michelle, that's been a kind of working hypothesis. Did China instigate these? It's not clear if they instigated them. Did they help orchestrate these? Well, China has a fairly deft hand in how they do these things. And both these things are things we can't discount. Did they have a role in starting up what happened on October 7th? There's been nothing to show that they did. Were they aware of what could happen on October 7th beforehand? That's a distinct possibility we have to recognize. That's very possible. Certainly, if you look at what happened up in Ukraine, it's pretty clear that Xi knew before the invasion that was going to happen. Putin actually went to Beijing, as you recall. They had the whole Olympic thing. It looked like they had basically held off on the invasion until the Olympics were done, the Winter Olympics, and then they went ahead and did the invasion. And that looked very orchestrated. And there's been a lot of discussion about that. That was pretty clear that Xi knew what was going to happen there. Obviously, he didn't try to talk Putin out of it. clearly, because that's it did happen, it did occur. Um, this all helps G, and it helps with his specific strategy, if you will, if the United States is drawn into other conflicts elsewhere in the world.
Right.
And if you want to go back to World War II, that's kind of what happened. I wouldn't say that, Germany certainly knew that Japan was looking at attacking Pearl Harbor. That's been fairly well documented. And for the U.S. to be divided between, two wars, if you will, would help either side because of what was going on. So it's not a new concept as to divide and conquer, if you will. And now you have the U.S., supporting our Ukraine, obviously supporting Israel, but supporting Israel and basically supporting a much broader strategy throughout the Middle East that includes the Red Sea, as well as and also with the presence of U.S. forces in places like Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. So all of this takes away resources that could be dedicated to the Pacific, that could be used for deterrence against what China is doing on the water. And China is certainly fully aware of what they're doing there, and probably orchestrating a good deal of this more than what we know.
All right, so let's now elaborate on the importance of this as a shipping area. According to the UN back in 2016, around 21% of all global trade went through the South China Sea. You have more updated figures, and again, that was back in 2016. As you mentioned, now there are major disruptions to other shipping and trade routes, with the Red Sea disrupted by the Iranian-backed Houthis firing missiles rather indiscriminately, the Russia-Ukraine war obviously causing global supply chain issues. So help us understand exactly how crucial this South China Sea route is now to global shipping and trade.
Well, most of the shipping, and depending on how you look at it, you can look at it in terms of gross tons, you can look at a number of certainly container traffic, but also you have to look at tanker traffic, and I say that with gas and oil traffic across the board. When you look at it, it's a phenomenal impact. Literally most of the shipping goes through the South China Sea from an economic standpoint. Now, different categories have different levels that they look at, but if you certainly look at container shipping, that is a preponderance of stuff that's impacted by what's happening in the South China Sea. I'd also remind everybody the South China Sea also is right next to the Sea of Japan. And of course, that is a much, you have basically a larger total waterway that could be impacted by a potential conflict with China. It's not just that one section of the water. Japan is very much leaning into this, looking at what could happen, how disruptive that could be. And it's not just stuff that goes through the South China Sea. It's not just material that comes from China or from Taiwan that could be disrupted. It's also the total impact that it would have on places like Japan. And hence, Japan has literally broken out of decades, literally since World War II, of taking a more passive stance, if you will, from a defense standpoint, to a much more active and aggressive stance with that. Right now, they are signing a mutual, was essentially a mutual defense agreement with the Philippines, which is rather interesting when you look at the history of Japan and the Philippines, and certainly the history of World War II. They're having an agreement to support each other in defense matters, and that is all aimed at dealing with this overarching threat of China in the South China Sea. And that is what Japan recognizes. Now, I actually was stationed in a part of Japan, Okinawa, that is in the South China Sea. That's one of the reasons that we've always had a presence there for quite some time. And so I'm very familiar with this. I was literally in Asia when the Philippine Navy grounded the Sierra Madre, that ship I talked about at the Second Thomas Shoal. I think it was in 1989. So I'm very familiar with some of the history there that goes back. The difference is what China has done to its Navy, which is vastly expanded, and what they're doing sort of almost this hybrid warfare stand with their Coast Guard in the South China Sea.
So a lot of very intentional movements and provocations that have a far-reaching history. How would a conflict there now, though, increase global supply chain issues? I mean, what would that mean for various economic regions, for various goods? I mean, surely this would create more inflation, worldwide and certainly here in the US. Help us understand why you think that this is potentially so crippling to the global economy and very detrimental to the US if conflicts there escalate even short of a full conflict, just even if there's continued skirmishes.
A lot of times when people think of China, they think of the made in China, the manufactured goods. And certainly that is significant. I mean, there's a lot of goods. If you go to any big box store, for example, and look at the number of things made in China, you would quickly realize that's a large part of the inventory that they carry. So literally store shelves will start going empty, but it's also much bigger than that. If you look at semiconductors, which is huge in Taiwan semiconductors, which in certain categories controls up to 80% of the semiconductor industry or market, if you will, that would be shut down completely. Certainly any semiconductors coming from China would be shut down, but it would have phenomenal disruption of the supply chain around the world, because it's difficult to think of anything these days that has any electronic components, to include cars or anything else, that isn't reliant upon semiconductors. And so it would be massively disruptive, despite a lot of what's called nearshoring, trying to bring some of that semiconductor manufacturing capability to the U.S. It's still not caught up yet to make up for the potential deficit in that availability in that area. Also in rare earths, if you look at China, they actually do mine a lot of rare earths. They have a very substantial capability in that, but they really have a huge capability in processing. And this is after decades of subsidizing their rare earths industry. They knocked out rare earths production capacity in other countries simply because they were cheaper. And they made it that way. They took advantage of their WTO status, and they basically did some very predatory marketing, if you will, around the world to corner that market. Now we're all dependent upon them for certain rare earths that are absolutely vital for high-tech manufacturing. That would get shut down, and that's not something that can be turned on somewhere else quickly. That takes years and years and years to build that capability up. We recognize that. Other countries have recognized that. They're trying to nearshore the mining. They're trying to nearshore the production, if you will, the refining of these various different rare earth materials. But with that, it's going to take a while to catch up. And lithium is also another area. With lithium batteries, it's not so much what China produces, it's what China controls. And China is not just operating in China. They have huge interests. CATL, for example, has huge interests with the lithium supply chain all around the world, going into the Pacific region across the board, but also actually some of the stuff they're doing much closer to home in South America. They have a huge thing. In fact, we just saw that there was a coup attempt in Bolivia. So they have this critical position with a lot of this. And by the way, when they take that lithium out, they send it across the Pacific, and that's where they actually process that to create stuff that they can export everywhere. So it's a supply chain lock that they have. If the South China Sea, if the Sea of Japan is tied up with a major war, all of that supply chain will be massively disrupted. We'll have just overwhelming inflation. It's tough to even say what that would look like because of the second, third order effects, but there would be huge disruption to the global marketplace.
Does it have to be an overwhelming war, or is it enough that there is conflict there, much like we have in the Red Sea, where it's just making it more difficult for ships to go through and to operate as they would normally? When you have that route blocked or problematic, combined with increased tensions and conflicts in the South China Sea area and Sea of Japan, again, not necessarily a full-out war, but just increased tensions, is that enough to have a big economic impact?
Michelle, that's an excellent point, and that's a great question. In fact, that's one of the big scenarios they're looking at for Taiwan, which is rather than trying to do an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, which is very problematic. As you know, I kind of have a background with amphibious operations and very familiar with it. In World War II, the U.S. had looked at going into what was then called Formosa, which is Taiwan. We didn't do it. And part of it is because it's such a difficult place to conduct amphibious operation. So that's not a foregone conclusion that China would go that option. But one of the ones that is before them, one of the things that they've clearly been rehearsing over and over again in various areas around Taiwan is setting up a potential naval blockade. Not too different from what the U.S. did with Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but to set up a huge naval blockade. And then the question is, what do we do? Are we going to risk an all-out war to block a naval blockade? And by the way, it could be a limited blockade. They may not block everything. They may just block some things. And so with that, we're going to have to figure out, would the U.S. instigate this? Or I should say, would we accelerate this into a full kinetic confrontation? It'd certainly be a huge escalation if we did. Do we want to be the first ones to, pull the trigger, if you will? Would Taiwan respond with kinetic means? Would they use anti-ship missiles or anti-air missiles to block this thing? There's a lot of scenarios there which kind of fall into that lower threshold, if you will. Not quite complete all-out war, but setting up the circumstances where it's right on that border between going to all-out war. And of course, once that's crossed, then everything I just talked about kind of kicks in.
Right. And then, as you said, just that is enough to create major economic disruptions to global supply chains, increasing costs of goods everywhere. And many countries already dealing with very high levels of inflation, certainly here in the U.S. Hal, you mentioned this Japan potentially having a defense pact with the Philippines. We know that the U.S. has a defense pact with the Philippines. Now, sometimes the concern with these defense pacts is that an incident intentionally started, unintentionally escalates to a level that then these defense pacts get triggered, right? That, Chinese Coast Guard may take some action against the Philippines as they're trying to assert strength and dominance, but that somehow, due to some potential rogue players, gets out of hand. It escalates much more than intentioned. And before you know it, you have a bigger situation that then potentially triggers these defense pacts with other countries. How much are we at risk of something like that happening? And what would that mean?
Of course, it could mean, obviously, it could drag us into what some might call World War III. If it eventually, the pendulum, if basically all the pieces started, falling into place where it triggered mutual defense pacts. Now, what we don't have in the Pacific is something like NATO. NATO is kind of interesting. In Europe, of course, it's 30 some nations and all basically tied together, saying an attack on one is an attack on all. That's not the same thing in the Pacific. What you have in the Pacific is a series of bilateral agreements between countries. The U.S. has a bilateral agreement with Japan. We have a bilateral agreements with South Korea. Certainly with the Philippines, as mentioned. Our relationship with Australia, New Zealand is very, very close. Has always been very close. They're also part of what's called the Five Eyes, which are countries that have a heightened intelligence sharing, intelligence cooperation arrangement that goes back before literally World War II. So that you do have a series of bilateral agreements, which potentially could trigger. And of course, the example being World War I, where basically, you'd have one agreement, basically an assassination that took place, in the Balkans, triggered a series of things that led to World War I. And that's, and of course, that's the great fear, is that the U.S. gets pulled into, a kinetic attack or kinetic confrontation with China, do the Philippines. And then China responds in some ways. It triggers our agreement with Japan or something like that. And next thing you know, you got all the countries in there basically pulled into a big military confrontation, a big war, if you will, across the board. That's possible. I would point out one thing, though, with the Philippines. President Marcos is a different president. He's definitely not President Duterte, thank goodness. And President Marcos, with that recent confrontation, or basically where the sailor almost lost his thumb, or I'm not sure, he may eventually lose it, but in that confrontation there, he was quick to immediately come out and make a public statement saying this does not trigger the mutual defense agreement with the U.S. We do not see this as a confrontation that's at that level. And he's been very careful about making that very clear as to what is triggering what or what is not triggering what. And that's probably not something that's done in isolation. I have no doubt that there's a lot of discussion between the U.S., between Washington, D.C., and with Manila when something like this happens. And certainly we are monitoring very closely everything that happens in the South China Sea. So it's not like we're taking a reactive stance and staying back. I mean, if something happens there, boom, everybody's immediately on the phones or on a video conferencing or whatever, trying to work out, what will be the statements, what will be the reaction, what do we do, what do we don't do. So that's something that's being actively worked all the time. But the scenario you talk about, the cascading effect, if you will, that is a serious consideration. And I would say if you're at Indo-Pacific Command in Honolulu, that's something they walk in every day and they're looking at what could trigger what.
Well, with all due respect to that sailor who lost his thumb or may lose his thumb, I mean, that doesn't seem as though that is something of significant consequence to trigger a bigger retaliation or escalation. I get that that's a symptom of a trend that's ongoing. So it brings a question then, is it more likely, Hal, that this just passes? We do know that the Philippines and China held talks on the South China Sea today on Tuesday. They didn't reach any real agreement on how to prevent a similar altercation like the one earlier in June, but they did agree on the need to restore trust and rebuild confidence and better manage maritime disputes. But then at the same time, the Philippines Department of Foreign Affairs issued a statement saying that it will be, quote, relentless in protecting interests and upholding its sovereignty, sovereign rights and jurisdiction in the West Philippine Sea, which is obviously what Manila uses to refer to the waters within its exclusive economic zone. But isn't it just more likely that this just passes rather than escalates dramatically?
It could slow down for a while. I think this meeting that they just had, and first off, it was classic sort of diplomatic language that didn't really say a lot other than we're going to meet, we're going to confer, we're going to try and de-escalate these things, we're going to make sure that they don't blow up into something else. It was basically an agreement to say, look, let's try and tamp this down a little bit, if you will, to keep this thing from getting worse. At the same time, the Philippines made it very clear, they have their territorial waters, they have their exclusive economic zone, they have the international court ruling on this in 2016 as far as that goes. And they're not going to, there's diplomatic side, but there's also, making it very clear as their position side. At the same time, if you've been looking at the language by China, they too have been saying, we'd like to see some, more coordination, if you will, or more discussion. But at the same time, they have not backed down on their claims of waters either. And by the way, I was recently in the Philippines for a couple of weeks, and I will say that when you're there, it is the West Philippine Sea. There is no further discussion on that. It's very clear as to what that body of water is. That's what it's called there. They recognize that China has another name for it, and some maps have mistakenly called it the South China Sea. But they always say, no, that is the West Philippine Sea. They're very clear about that.
Right. And look, lots of countries have claims to parts of the South China Sea. Taiwan being one of them. And there was an altercation there between a Chinese Coast Guard ship detaining a Taiwanese fishing boat not too long ago and its crew members. And in response, Taiwan mobilized 2 Coast Guard vessels. That led to a standoff with 4 Chinese ships. And Chinese and Taiwanese tensions have risen quite dramatically since Lai Ching-te was elected as the new president of Taiwan in January, because Beijing views him as pushing more aggressively for Taiwanese independence. China considers Taiwan a renegade province. So you take all of these factors into consideration, and the point that you made earlier, Hal, and that is that, the U.S. is pretty distracted with all of these conflicts in the Middle East, in Russia, Ukraine, spread very, very thin. And some analysts, including some guests on this show, have implied that the opportune time to strike from China's perspective, or take action against Taiwan, or take more aggressive action in the South China Sea, would be right before the U.S. elections, given the division and the chaos of the political situation in the U.S. and what many perceive to be the Biden administration's weakness on the world stage. And very significantly, the U.S. stretched thin with all of these conflicts. You alluded to that earlier. Do you think that China may take some kind of action this year, or continue to play the longer game?
Well, they've always played the long game, and so I don't discount that, but I do agree with many that we need to be looking at the coming months. You're absolutely correct. With this election coming up, that's something we look at with virtually every major presidential election. Is that is a time of vulnerability. It's a time of transition. If somebody's going to try and do something, a foreign actor like China, that's the opportune time to do it. As you mentioned, the term distraction, certainly the election distracts the entire United States, and honestly, it distracts the rest of the world too, because they're paying very close attention to what's happening here. And so it is a time of vulnerability, or a window of vulnerability, in terms of our ability to react, despite the fact, and certainly any combatant commander around the world would say, look, we're always leaning forward. We have our plans in place. We know what we're supposed to do if things happen. So they would not say that they're, not prepared for whatever's happening. But it's not just distraction. It's also the strain on resources. We only have so many ships. We only have so many planes, so many troops. We're having to position stuff in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Certainly stuff that we didn't have to think about putting there, say, a year ago. We didn't have nearly that big of a presence. In fact, our presence there was fairly small because, frankly, the Somali pirate threat had been pretty much dissipated by that point. So we were able to put a lot more resources into the South China Sea, into I should say the West Pacific in general. Our presence there was much greater, and now that's being divided between what's called Indo-Pacific Command, which has the West Pacific, and Central Command, which has things like Yemen and certainly dealing with issues in with Lebanon, Israel, certainly with the Gaza Strip, and obviously anything in the Persian Gulf, to include Iraq, and then looking up into Syria. So you have 2 combatant commanders, both of whom probably want more resources, and that limits our ability to respond to other places. And when things happen, particularly when you're dealing with ships, it's not like you can just turn around and move on a dime. It takes a while to move a task force or a ship, halfway around the world. And those are some of the things that they're having to deal with right now.
Right. Hal, you mentioned the presidential elections, and there was quite a strong comment during the debate between former President Trump and President Biden regarding all of these geopolitical hotspots that seem to have flourished, shall we say, under the Biden administration. Let's take a listen to what former President Trump had to say about that and the prospect of President Biden bringing the U.S. closer to a global world war.
These are wars that will never end with him. He will drive us into World War III, and we're closer to World War III than anybody can imagine. We are very, very close to World War III, and he's driving us there.
So, Hal, former President Trump, known to be a tad hyperbolic, known to exaggerate, but does he have a point there? Do you think we are closer to World War III than before?
I think a lot of experts, a lot of senior leaders around the world think that the chance of what would effectively be World War III, if the war breaks out in the Pacific, you just look at the geography. It's like, okay, now we're tied up with wars all around the world. That would be that big. And then, of course, the issue is what would happen with Ukraine if the U.S. resources are pulled into dealing with this, what would be a huge conflict in the Pacific. What is our ability to support these other two wars? How would we be constrained? And would that embolden Russia to do something else? You know, I just was recently in Estonia. A little bit before that, I was in Lithuania. I look at the Baltic states. Certainly, the Baltic states have been very, very vocal about their perception of the Russian threat, which has always been there. They've been taking some very significant measures to try and improve their own defensive capabilities there. But they recognize that an aggressive Russia on the warpath, if you will, if successful in Ukraine, will not stop there. Putin has made it very clear that he wants to basically recreate the Russian Empire. I'm not going to say the Soviet Union per se, but he definitely wants to recreate what he sees as the Russian Empire, and part of that is taking the Baltic states. And so all those countries in that region are very much concerned that they are vulnerable to attack. If the U.S. is tied up with a major war in the Pacific, that's potentially less resources that could go to defending our NATO allies, and so that makes them even more nervous. And so by the way, once Russia crosses in or attacks a NATO country, that triggers Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. And at that point, by definition, you have got World War III. That basically you got two big segments of the world going on. I'm not saying something would happen in the Western Hemisphere, but, you know, who knows what would happen with Cuba and Venezuela. If something like that was going on, whatever machinations they might choose to do. And certainly Venezuela might see a good reason to go into that part of Guyana that they've been claiming at the same time. So you could actually end up having a number of things tick off around the world, which would certainly meet that definition of a
number of conflicts tick off around the world, and the South China Sea being the potential tinderbox.
That's a potential. That's the center of gravity. As certainly, if you look at the big threat, the one that impacts markets, where the U.S. probably has the biggest financial interest overall, that is basically the South China Sea and what's happening in the West Pacific. It's not that we're not concerned about these other parts of the world. We are, and we are very much engaged there. But certainly, from an economic standpoint, the Middle East is big, but frankly, looking at certainly the area, Israel is a critical ally. Certainly, the countries around it are also some are important allies. Syria, not so much, but we have a long-standing relationship. We have a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia across the board. But if you look at the impact that's going to have on the U.S. markets, a major war across the Middle East is big, but a major war in the West Pacific has a probably bigger potential. One thing I might mention, though, if there is that war in the Pacific, you kind of have to go back to the Middle East and say, okay, what is Iran thinking about doing now? What might they decide to do now? And that's a big concern as well.
Right, because as you discussed, with these various points of conflict and commotion serving as a distraction and draining resources, dividing focus and attention, it does then allow for other players to seize the opportunity and act, and for players like Iran, maybe even Venezuela, to be emboldened and take action that they may not have taken otherwise, but then they see the opportunity. And as you say, because the South China Sea is so important economically, intensified conflicts, even skirmishes there could force the US in, even if it doesn't really want to be involved, especially at this time. But Hal, if China isn't going to really intentionally really push and really escalate, you could still have a scenario develop that forces the US in. So what kind of scenario could unwittingly drag the US in?
A potential scenario in the South China Sea, for example, what if the Chinese Coast Guard was to stop another resupply mission to the Sierra Madre? And what if they did what they did last time, where they were actually blocking a medical evacuation of somebody who needed to get out of there? They literally were blocking the evacuation itself, putting someone's life at risk. And that was one where, it was depending on which side talks about it, whether the guns are drawn or whether they had their hands on their weapons, it's not quite clear. But if that thing had gone to small arms firing, that could escalate into one of the vessels decide they're going to use one of their larger deck guns, if you will, to resolve this issue. Okay, now you've got deck guns being used. Potentially, you could see where they would call in larger forces to reinforce their position. With that, next thing you know, you've got yourself a major confrontation at sea. Now, whether that could be, that could be cauterized, if you will, stopped right there, and diplomatic stuff steps in, not quite clear. But that is how something like that could quickly escalate from something involving personnel in small boats or smaller boats on the sea to something involving larger ships that could eventually involve more forces coming in to do this. And depending on how it went, if China wanted to push the point even further, they could say, we're not backing down. This is our sea space. We own it. We control it. And, the Philippines doesn't back down. Now, the Philippines doesn't have the size of forces or the composition of forces where they could go toe-to-toe with them. But eventually you could see where that potentially could escalate into a larger confrontation. I would say in any of those steps, you would see certainly many attempts to build diplomatic off-ramps, but that is a big fear. And of course, the big concern is that you can build the diplomatic off-ramps, but if one of the players does not want to get off, they're going to keep going that direction. China could decide, nope, this is it. We've decided we're going to push this thing all the way. And that's where you could end up having a major confrontation in the South China Sea involving the Philippines, which could potentially trigger our mutual defense agreement with them. And certainly that might be a time that China says, as long as we're dealing with this, maybe, and then everybody's distracted with that, maybe this is the time to do something in militarily with Taiwan. And that's how these things can escalate into larger conflicts.
Right. And larger conflicts seem more likely when you have growing defense pacts and alliances around the world. And I want to go back to another development you touched on, and that's this potential alliance between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And to that end, there's been a development. There's been a more formal agreement now made between Russia's President Putin and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. A couple of weeks ago, Putin visited Kim Jong-un, and they signed a mutual defense pact for mutual military assistance if either country is attacked, strengthening their defense cooperation and expanding trade and investment ties. So this could bring North Korea in here. And this pact also makes it even more difficult to now stop North Korea's nuclear ambitions, which include ballistic missiles capable of reaching the continental US. And Putin also suggested the possibility of supplying North Korea with high-precision weapons in response to the Western military aid that's been given to Ukraine. And Hal, this agreement is reminiscent of Cold War alliances. So how do you see this factoring in here? You could say that it's not a coincidence that this is happening. You have defense pacts being signed on both sides. Chess pieces are being moved into position on both sides of the board. And we're seeing more clear lines of divisions with a bifurcation of the world, the allies and axis. Of course, depending on one's perspective. What do you make of this, Hal?
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't say this. It's kind of interesting. Putin goes to to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Jong Un, and they have the big ceremonies and all the flags waving and everything else, which is kind of what they do in North Korea anytime somebody comes in there. All right, it's very orchestrated across the board. One of the things is it kind of codified what's reality, which is that North Korea is pulling a lot of its old war stocks, a lot of its old ammunition, and they're shipping it huge amounts, mostly by train, some by ship, but mostly by train, across to support Russia's war. In Ukraine, there's been photographic imagery, if you will, of some of the ammunition, and you can clearly see it's North Korean ammunition being loaded into Russian weapon systems that's being used. Now, there is a kind of a mixed side of this, which is a lot of that ammunition is so old that a lot of it's defunct. It's not very accurate. Some of it actually explodes in the artillery tubes. So it's not the best quality ammunition across the board, but that's something they're seeing. What the concern is what will Russia give North Korea in return? And that has huge strategic import. North Korea, as we all know, has nuclear weapons capabilities. They were doing underground tests for quite some time. Their nuclear program has been only improving over time. Also, their ballistic missile capabilities have been improving dramatically. It's believed they have a ballistic missile that might have a range of 15,000 kilometers. They could literally launch a missile from North Korea, and it could cover pretty much most of the continental U.S. It could potentially hit Washington, D.C. with a warhead. What they don't have is an RV or reentry vehicle that is an absolutely crucial part of that delivery chain, where when it comes into the atmosphere, you have to have a reentry vehicle that will go through the atmosphere, not bounce on the atmosphere, that won't destroy the warhead as it's coming through the atmosphere, and put that warhead where they intend to deliver it. That's technology they don't have. That's technology that Russia's had for a very, very long time. And the fear is that they might give them that missing piece of technology they need to create that credible nuclear threat. All of a sudden, the U.S. isn't just concerned about North Korea launching missiles in the Pacific. They're concerned that North Korea could have the capability to launch missiles much, much further into the continental U.S. That's a big concern. That changes a lot of what are we doing in terms of our anti-missile capability, a lot of different things across the board, which goes to the amount of instability that we see across the world. And then, of course, if there is a war in the Pacific, what would North Korea do? Kim Jong-un, I don't think, is one of the more stable international actors, if you will. And whereas he doesn't have tremendous, a really high-grade conventional capabilities like he used to have, that's another fear, is he's going to get some improved conventional capabilities to improve those old tanks and armored vehicles and artillery that they've had for, well, decades and decades. They go back to literally his grandfather's time, if you will. But the fear is that Kim Jong-un might do something on the border. He might do something to South Korea. It might involve weapons of mass destruction, like chemical weapons or something like that. And of course, the thing he would often hold out there is, if there's a big response, he says, I've got nuclear weapons that would keep anybody from coming into North Korea. Well, that gets to be a little bit bigger if they have a nuclear weapon that could possibly reach the continental United States and cause devastation here. You kind of go through all these things and you realize this thing could escalate in ways that just simply weren't there a few years back, and that's a big concern.
Right. And in terms of alliances, not only was Kim Jong-un meeting with Putin, but Putin is expected to hold talks with Xi Jinping and Turkey's Erdogan this week, meetings with the Chinese and the Turkish presidents during the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Astana. That's at least according to the Russian state news agency. Last time Putin met with Xi was in May. He visited China on his first foreign trip after being inaugurated for a fifth term. as Russia's president. And we know that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is very important political, economic, international security and defense organization established by China and Russia in 2001. Does that organization seem to be getting more momentum, in your opinion, Hal?
I've been looking at the Shanghai cooperation as something that's kind of interesting. It's been going on for quite some time. And it has a different group of players. It kind of reminds me of BRIC or BRICS or which seems to be getting bigger and bigger. Certainly beyond the four original main players. But with that, then there's other groupings as well. The Quad, much talked about, informal grouping with India, the U.S., Australia, and Japan. That's become a grouping that primarily was focused on more trade issues, and then it became more of a military type of thing. Interestingly enough, that's been talked about. There's also a grouping of nations in the Pacific itself called the Squad, not to be confused with what's going on, not be confused with Congress, the U.S. Congress, and that particular Squad. But that's another grouping we see that's taking place, and all of these are happening at the same time. Now, one thing I would point out with President Erdogan in Turkey, he maintains communications with certainly all of his neighbors, and Russia is a neighbor, and he maintains communications, and he's been playing a critical role in being a kind of a go-between, if you will, in working out various arrangements with the war in Ukraine, and Turkey has actually taken lead on a three country NATO task force, which is clearing mines in the Black Sea to enable greater transport of things like grain coming down from Ukraine. So when you see these meetings, I also look at the other side, which is, that's communication, that's diplomacy, but there's the other side, which is real world. What are they doing on the water in the Black Sea region? That is, that is such a critical waterway, if you will, to what's going on. And if you look at what Turkey's doing there, you see where they're taking a very substantive leadership position. They're putting their own forces into action to do something about that. So that's a pretty important thing that we need to keep in mind in that regard. So they've been doing some pretty important stuff.
Yeah, pretty important stuff. Yet another flashpoint globally. Hal, as we start to wrap up here, would have to get your thoughts on the likelihood of an escalation between Hezbollah, another Iranian-backed terrorist proxy, and Israel. Hezbollah has been firing rockets into Israel the day after the October 7th attacks, when Hamas invaded Israel and triggered Israel's retaliation with the war on Gaza. That conflict still ongoing, and now the Hezbollah-Israeli conflict seems to be escalating, with civilians from both Israel's north and Lebanon's south being evacuated. The U.S. and Europe urging restraints from both sides. Where do you see this happening? Where do you see this going?
Well, right now it appears to be going toward what will probably be a full war, a complete second front on that northern frontier, that northern border, if you will. There's not the de-escalation on certainly from Hezbollah's side. You're just not seeing de-escalation. One of the things Hezbollah said is that they when October 7th happened, they joined in with basically launching strikes across the border, causing a mass evacuation of Israelis that lived up near the Lebanese border. They had to pull back, and of course, there's been a lot of destruction of towns. There's been fires. There's been all kinds of things, and of course, Israel has responded with strikes up north, hitting Hezbollah positions, and there's have to be some evacuation of those living in the southern Lebanon region. Lebanon itself, of course, is at a very delicate socioeconomic precipice, because a few years back, their economy essentially collapsed. It's about half of what it was some years ago. A lot of that triggered with that massive explosion in Beirut with the port. which I would point out that that particular warehouse that exploded with what looked like a small nuclear bomb going off was actually controlled by Hezbollah. That little political nuance is not missed by anybody in Lebanon, by the way. They all recognize that. But there is great fear that if there is another war between Hezbollah and Israel, that it could literally just cause massive devastation to the remaining socioeconomic fabric, if you will, of Lebanon, turning Lebanon into what would widely be considered a failed state, if you will. So that's a big concern. I just don't know where the off ramp is, because Hezbollah has said, as long, once there's a ceasefire, once there's a permanent ceasefire, if you will, certainly in the Gaza Strip with Hamas, they're going to stop firing into Israel. Well, the problem with that is that they could always turn it back on, and that doesn't really solve the long-term threat issue that Hezbollah poses to Israel, with 150,000 missiles supplied by Iran that they have poised, ready to rain down on Israel. They could overwhelm the Iron Dome air defense system. So Israel is at a strategic crossroads right now as to what it does. And certainly Hamas is not accepting of the proposal that's on the table right now. And Israel has pretty much cleared most of the Hamas-controlled territory down there, which means you may never see a ceasefire put in place, because, frankly, there may not be really much of Hamas left to agree to a ceasefire by the time it comes about. You have to look at where things are on the ground, which leads to, well, will Hezbollah continue firing into Israel? And by the way, will the Houthis then continue to cause all the problems that they're causing in the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and the Gulf of Aden? And the answer to both of those is probably yes, which means that we're looking for a more protracted conflict that could escalate into something much, much bigger than it is right now. By the way, Iran, and it's tough to say because they don't have unlimited capabilities, and that strike they did against Israel with the 300 missiles and drones really didn't have a whole lot of effect in terms of actually impacting on Israel, but some did make it through. However, Iran has said that if there is a full-on war with Hezbollah, that they're going to weigh in and join that war in some way, shape, or form. We're already seeing some of the Iranian proxies in Iraq and presumably Syria making their way into Hezbollah-controlled territory in southern Lebanon to provide additional forces there. And it could be a rather substantial number by the time it's all said and done. So what could happen is you see a much broader conflict with implications, flashpoints, if you will, that go well beyond just southern Lebanon.
Right. As we said, no shortage of tinderboxes that can really explode and escalate around the world. And then, when you put it in the context of various conflicts happening around the world with various alliances, you could even say that we're at the beginning of a World War III. Not that I want to use that term lightly. And as you mentioned, Hal, with these distractions, with the resources spread thin, the South China Sea may then be ripe for a major disruption, as China, short of going into Taiwan necessarily, creates a bigger military blockade there and lays a stronger claim to that region, which is why you said at the top of this interview that you think that is the biggest geopolitical threat and the one that's most being ignored, if I may rephrase you there correctly.
It's interesting you say World War III, because we say it rather hesitatingly because of all the implications of what that could mean. Certainly with the threat of, the ultimate threat would be an apocalyptic doomsday scenario with nuclear missiles flying back and forth across oceans and continents. But it's interesting. There's a webinar I do with critical infrastructure across the country. We originally started talking about this. It was a Ukraine update, and then it was kind of grew into certainly, beyond Ukraine update into looking at Israel, Hamas, and eventually we started calling it a global threat update, and we started tagging it with a world of wars. And whereas we're not in World War III, we're definitely in a world of wars. Now, whether those things merge into one larger conflict, that's the big concern, and also the concern is when you look at the players, the networking, the linkages, who they're associated with, who they're being supported by. You see where there is this axis, if you will, of countries, as General Mattis or former SecDef Mattis says, a Chinese-led axis of Russia, Iran, North Korea. I think we're going to have to start thinking in those sorts of geostrategic terms. And I think we're going to have to view the world and look at these conflicts in those sorts of terms, that when Iran is launching a series of conflicts throughout the Middle East, well, is it just Iran or is it that larger axis that we're really looking at? And that's one of the big changes. By the way, changes that has enormous implications on the global supply chain, on global trade, and our access to critical materials and manufactured goods, not to mention the markets where we sell our own goods.
Right. So, Hal, we've discussed these shifts from a global monetary perspective many times on Kitco and the bifurcation of the global monetary system, with similar players taking sides of being pro-dollar or against the dollar. But just to bring it back to a financial angle, you're seeing these developments. You're a financial risk planner and consultant, tremendous background as a former Marine intelligence officer, not a portfolio manager, mind you. But how are you positioning your portfolio, your assets? What makes sense to someone like you when you're seeing the chess pieces move on the board as they are right now?
I would say you got to look where companies are positioned, where they're invested. There's a lot of larger companies that have huge vulnerability, if you will, and I call it vulnerability, with what they put into China. One time offshoring into China was, going, great guns. Certainly in the 90s, the O's into the early teens, putting stuff in China made a lot of sense. Certainly Elon Musk has put a lot of manufacturing capability into China. Apple is very much invested into China. A lot of major companies are fully invested in China, and China is invested the other way. That's starting to change, and that's really shifting. I'm a big believer in this nearshoring trend that we're seeing, where we're bringing manufacturing out of China. If you look at what's investment capital going into China, foreign investment, that is all but dried up. And I'll tell you what's really interesting to me, and this just happened in the last few weeks, is Moroni over in Italy. And you have to remember, Italy was one of the, basically the only EU country that had a substantial Belt and Road Initiative program going on within its borders, that she has made it very clear that they want to pull out of this whole Belt and Road Initiative concept altogether. So what I'm seeing across the board is, if you have a portfolio that's heavily invested or dependent upon China, you might want to relook at it. You might want to rethink this. And you might want to look at the implicit supply chains within whatever enterprise it is, or collection of enterprises that you're invested in. One of the things that we talk about with critical infrastructure is to look at this entire supply chain. And one of the things we've really been making very clear is you have to look at the maritime supply chain, because a lot of times, I got to tell you, for decades, people were kind of ignoring that. It was cheap to ship by sea. Containerized movement of goods was basically just expanding over and over and over again. And now we're seeing things which show the vulnerability of that supply chain. For example, ports in the Pacific, like Singapore, are backed up. They're having to turn away ships. The problem is that now the ships can't go through the Red Sea. That was 15% of global maritime trade going through the Red Sea into the Suez Canal. Over half of that has dropped off completely, and those that go in there have to pay huge insurance rates, maritime insurance rates, for going through that area. So now what you're seeing is this really long leg around the Horn of Africa to move goods. That's slowed everything down, which means a lot of ships are offloading their containers at ports. Singapore has basically said, look, we're full. We can't take any more containers. because of that, and waiting and then loading up these ships for these very long legs. Whereas before they would have sent ships on much shorter legs, so they would have taken a lower capacity because the leg was much shorter. Now they're having to change the entire way they're doing that. That goes to price, that goes to availability of goods, that goes to how the ports are being used, that goes to ports not just in the Pacific, but also in Europe and North America. These are things you have to look at in what you're investing in. How exposed are you to these critical waterways, these critical places, these critical potential battlefields, if you will, in the future?
Right. And as we discussed earlier, all of these supply chain issues ultimately lead to higher cost of goods, higher inflation, which makes the case for store of value assets. Like many of our viewers who like gold would say that gold is a store of value asset against inflation, or for those that see Bitcoin as digital gold as a store of value asset potentially as well, Bitcoin. I'll have to ask you, do you own any gold or any Bitcoin?
I'm actually not invested in either, which is very strange because my father was actually a gold miner of all things. He actually had a pretty big presence in mining gold in the Western United States for many years. I think you're going to see more investment in precious metals, particularly gold. Where I tend to focus more is on things like lithium and looking at rare earths and some critical materials like nickel and things. And when I look at that, I'm looking at what comes out of Russia, how much of that market they control, and how whatever's happening there is impacting on those global supply chains. Crypto is interesting. I mean, look, honestly, there are some cryptocurrencies that are not that substantial, shall we say, and then there's some like certainly Bitcoin, which is very substantial. I should say I'm not invested in Bitcoin, but my adult sons are invested in Bitcoin, and some would say that's maybe a generational thing. But certainly I've been paying attention to this ever since it really manifested itself. Certainly we've seen a lot of changes in that market, a lot of, some initial volatility, and we all saw what happened, with FTX, which kind of all got our attention. But then you're looking at, and that's cryptocurrency, not Bitcoin. But if you look at Bitcoin, it's a very substantial instrument. And what's interesting is some months back, I had a very, very good discussion with an El Salvador government official. And you may recall that El Salvador was the first country that actually went to cryptocurrency. That was the first nation state movement to cryptocurrency in the world. They're working through all the issues, of course, that go with that. But it is fascinating to see how this thing is changing across the board. And I do think that we're going to see cryptocurrency really start to take off, particularly as you're seeing that the U.S. dollar and other currencies are becoming a little. It's changing, shall we say? I wouldn't say less stable, but certainly if you look at what Russia's doing and what China's doing, they're trying to move away from the dollar-based system, and I think that will open up more opportunities for cryptocurrency across the board, and certainly probably the strongest one being Bitcoin.
Right. And yes, El Salvador, first country to declare Bitcoin legal tender and invest reserve assets in Bitcoin. And so far, that move seems to be paying off for Bukele. Now, Hal, full disclosure to you and to our audience, I do own Bitcoin. I also own gold, physical gold, and also have other exposure to gold via ETFs and miners. So like to be fully upfront about that. All right, Hal, as we wrap up here, final thoughts.
I think the final thoughts are we live in, as the Chinese would say, or the Chinese curse says, we live in interesting times. And we do need to stay tuned into what's going on around the world. We need to be probably more tuned than we've ever been. And this is not the time to pull back. I know there is certainly a large body politic, and it's happened in history in the U.S. before with, America first. And certainly no one is saying, hey, pull back on any of your patriotism by any way, shape, or form. But on the other hand, we have to be globally engaged. And we have to be leaning forward. And I would say everybody just needs to be paying attention to what's going on. And by the way, if you think that, this is not the 1930s, We live in a globally integrated economy. It's not so simple as it was back then. And certainly if you look at financial transactions, it's really not as simple as it was back then. And we all need to be aware of how these dots connect, if you will, how these different systems, if you will, operate on a global basis.
Well, Hal, as you said, like that Chinese curse, we are certainly living in interesting times. And we appreciate you helping us understand these times and helping us connect some of the dots and then back to the markets and the economy. Thank you so much again for your time and for your insights. Hal Kempfer, we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Michelle.
All right. And as always, thank you to our viewers and a big thanks to our sponsor, Swan Bitcoin. And just a reminder again to our viewers that do see the long-term potential of Bitcoin and want to invest for their retirement, there is an IRA product that Swan Bitcoin offers, which allows you to invest directly in Bitcoin with your IRA. And there's a way to set it up, which is really very simple, where you're basically buying Bitcoin on autopilot. And then that allows you to take advantage of dollar cost averaging as you accumulate Bitcoin into your IRA. Now, there's a link in the description of this video with a special offer for Kitco viewers to help facilitate that process. Make sure to check that out. And as always, thank you again for checking out this video. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and leave us your comments. We love to hear from you. From me, Michelle Makori, and the rest of the Kitco team, we'll see you again soon.
On the Spot with Michelle Makori is brought to you by Swan Bitcoin. Swan Bitcoin IRA. Your legacy, your way. Real Bitcoin, not proxies. Traditional and Roth IRAs. Fast, easy setup. Start now at swan.com/retire.